Hello there. Ever felt a flutter of worry, a racing thought? Imagine feeling that, but the world told you it was something else entirely, maybe even dismissed it. Tonight we gently drift through history's pages to uncover the story of how anxiety in women was understood and treated in times past. If you find this quiet journey calming, please consider liking this video and subscribing for more. Let's begin. Okay, let's settle into the gentle rhythm of history now, drifting back, further back to the sun-drenched landscapes of ancient Greece. Picture the olive groves, the marble structures bathed in warm light, the birthplace of democracy, philosophy, and so much of Western thought. It was also a crucible for early medicine, a time when thinkers and physicians began looking for rational, natural explanations for the ailments that affected humankind, moving away from purely supernatural causes. Here, in this cradle of inquiry, we encounter one of the earliest, and perhaps most peculiar, explanations for what we might now understand as anxiety or distress in women. It's a concept deeply rooted in the physical body, a fascinating glimpse into how the ancient world perceived the female experience. Let's gently explore this idea together, the notion of the wandering womb. The very term hysteria, which echoed through medical texts for centuries, finds its origins here, derived from the Greek word hystera, meaning the uterus. For prominent physicians of the time, including the renowned Hippocrates, often called the father of medicine, the uterus wasn't just an organ. It was thought to possess a strange mobility, an almost animalistic life of its own within the female body. They believed this organ, the hystera, could become dislodged from its proper place in the lower abdomen and travel, or wander, throughout the body cavity. This wasn't seen as a psychological issue, not an emotional disturbance in the way we might think of it today. Instead, it was understood as a purely physical phenomenon, a mechanical problem, caused by this restless roaming organ. The prevailing medical philosophy sought tangible causes, and the wandering womb provided a convenient, albeit incorrect, explanation for a wide array of confusing symptoms experienced exclusively by women. Hippocrates and his followers developed detailed theories about why the womb might embark on these internal journeys. A central idea was that the uterus craved moisture. In women who were unmarried, widowed, or otherwise not regularly engaging in intercourse or bearing children, the womb was thought to become dry and light. Yearning for moisture, it would detach from its usual position and begin to move upwards within the body, seeking humidity from other organs. Think of it almost like a small creature, independent and driven by its own needs, traveling inside the body. This belief linked female health directly and inextricably to marriage and procreation. A womb anchored by pregnancy or watered by intercourse was considered less likely to stray. Therefore, a woman experiencing symptoms attributed to a wandering womb was often implicitly or explicitly seen as suffering due to her lack of marital or reproductive activity, placing the perceived cause firmly within our biological status. The symptoms attributed to this wandering womb, this hysteria, were remarkably varied and often dramatic, covering a wide spectrum of physical and neurological complaints. When the womb traveled upwards, it was believed to press against other vital organs, causing significant distress. If it pressed against the diaphragm and respiratory passages, it could cause a terrifying sense of suffocation, known as hysterical suffocation or globus hystericus, that feeling of a lump in the throat or difficulty breathing. If it lodged near the heart, it might cause palpitations or chest tightness. If it moved towards the head, it could result in dizziness, headaches, blurred vision, fainting spells, or even seizure-like convulsions. Having loss of voice, numbness, paralysis in the limbs, lethargy, general malaise, and even sudden changes in mood or behavior could all be blamed on the internal migrations of the uterus. Imagine the fear and confusion, experiencing breathlessness or fainting, only to be told it was because an organ was physically migrating inside you, pressing against your lungs or brain. Diagnosing this condition involved a combination of observing these diverse symptoms and considering the woman's social and reproductive status. Physicians would listen to the patient's account of her suffering, the shortness of breath, the feelings of pressure, the sudden weakness. They might perform a physical examination, although their understanding of internal anatomy was limited compared to ours. Crucially, they would inquire about her marital life, whether she had borne children or if she was widowed or celibate. If a woman presented with symptoms like faintness, anxiety, or breathing difficulties, and she was unmarried or childless, the diagnosis of a wandering womb became highly likely in the physician's mind. The focus remained steadfastly on the physical, on the uterus as the root cause. There was little room in this framework for considering emotional stress, trauma, or psychological factors as primary drivers of these experiences. The womb was the culprit, its journey the explanation. Given this physical understanding, the treatments devised by ancient Greek physicians aimed to physically coax the wandering womb back to its rightful place in the lower abdomen. The primary method was based on the idea that the uterus, like a small animal, could be influenced by smells, repelled by foul odors, and attracted by pleasant ones. Therefore, the treatment often involved a rather curious olfactory strategy. Foul-smelling substances would be administered near the woman's head, intended to drive the upwardly mobile womb downwards, away from the unpleasantness. Imagine substances like burning wool, rancid oil, pitch, sulfur, or even acrid herbs like garlic being held close to the patient's nose and mouth. The pungent, disagreeable smell was meant to offend the uterus and encourage its retreat. Simultaneously, pleasant fragrances would be applied to the lower body near the pelvic region to lure the womb back home. Perfumes, sweet-smelling herbs, fragrant oils, or fumigations with aromatic substances might be used vaginally or applied externally to the thighs and abdomen. The logic was simple: repel from above, attract from below. Picture the scene: a woman lying down, perhaps feeling faint or breathless, while a physician or attendant holds something noxious like burning pitch near her face and applies sweet floral scents or spices below. It seems utterly bizarre to us now, but within their understanding of the womb as a sentient, mobile entity sensitive to odors, it represented a rational, therapeutic approach. The entire focus was on physically manipulating the location of this supposedly wayward organ through the power of scent. Beyond the use of smells, other treatments reinforced the idea that the womb needed to be anchored or satisfied. Marriage and regular sexual intercourse were frequently prescribed as the most effective long-term cure for the wandering womb. The rationale was that pregnancy would weigh the uterus down, keeping it firmly in place, while intercourse would provide the necessary moisture to prevent it from becoming light and dry and embarking on its troublesome journeys. In essence, fulfilling a traditional reproductive role was seen as medicinal. Sometimes physicians might attempt more direct physical interventions, such as applying pressure to the abdomen to manually push the womb down, or using pessaries, objects inserted vaginally, perhaps soaked in fragrant substances. Sneezing could also be induced, with the forceful expulsion of air thought to help push the uterus downwards. All these methods stemmed from the same fundamental belief: a physical organ was out of place and physical means were required to return it. This ancient Greek understanding of the wandering womb had profound implications for how women's health and distress were perceived for centuries. By attributing such a wide range of symptoms, from anxiety and breathlessness to seizures and fainting, to a single migrating reproductive organ, it effectively reduced complex human experiences to a matter of female biology, specifically reproductive function. Emotional pain, psychological stress, social pressures, or trauma were largely discounted as contributing factors. The woman's suffering was contained within the narrative of her potentially malfunctioning womb, intrinsically linked to her marital status and childbearing. It created a framework where female distress was inherently physical, inherently tied to her reproductive capacity, and often implicitly blamed on a deviation from expected societal roles such as remaining unmarried or childless. This perspective laid a foundation for centuries of misunderstanding female health. So as we gently conclude this part of our journey, let's pause and reflect on this concept from ancient Greece: the wandering womb, the hysteria traveling through the body, causing suffocation, faintness, and distress, treated with foul smells near the face and sweet scents below. From our modern viewpoint, it seems incredibly strange, almost fantastical. Yet, within the context of early rational medicine seeking physical explanations for all ailments and a limited understanding of anatomy and psychology, it represented a logical, albeit incorrect, attempt to make sense of complex symptoms experienced by women. It highlights a persistent theme we will encounter again: the tendency to interpret female emotional and physical distress through the lens of reproductive biology. Let this idea settle, this image of the restless womb, as we prepare to drift forward in time to see how these notions evolved, persisted, and transformed in the centuries that followed. Let the gentle current of history carry us forward now, flowing from the philosophical shores of Greece into the vast, powerful Roman Empire. Imagine the sprawling cities, the organized legions, the feats of engineering, aqueducts, roads, grand arenas. Rome absorbed much from the cultures it encountered, and Greek medicine formed the bedrock of Roman medical thought, particularly when it came to understanding the complexities of the human body. While the Romans brought a certain pragmatism and advancements in areas like public sanitation and surgical techniques, the theoretical explanations for internal ailments, especially those concerning women, often echoed the ideas we encountered in Greece. The focus, sometimes subtly shifted but fundamentally persistent, remained intensely fixed upon the uterus as a source of uniquely female afflictions. We now drift into this Roman understanding, exploring their interpretation of female distress. Here, the Greek concept of hysteria finds a Roman counterpart, sometimes referred to by physicians with terms like furor uterinus. This Latin phrase translates roughly to uterine fury or uterine madness. While sharing roots with the Greek idea of a wandering womb causing physical obstruction, the Roman emphasis, suggested by the word furor, perhaps leaned more heavily into the perceived emotional and behavioral disturbances associated with the condition. It conjured images of not just physical discomfort like suffocation, but also intense agitation, irritability, melancholy, or behavior seen as irrational or uncontrolled. This wasn't necessarily seen as separate from the physical. Rather, the physical state of the uterus was believed to directly incite this fury or emotional turbulence, intertwining body and mind in a way dictated entirely by female anatomy. The underlying cause, much like in Greece, was often attributed to what Roman physicians perceived as an idle or unemployed uterus. The womb, particularly in virgins reaching maturity and widows or in women unable to conceive, was thought to become problematic if not fulfilling its natural purpose of procreation. One prevailing theory suggested that retained menstrual blood, if not discharged regularly, could stagnate and turn poisonous, releasing noxious vapors that ascended through the body, disrupting the mind and causing the agitated state of furor uterinus. Another related idea involved the retention of female seed, which, like its male counterpart, was believed to require release. If retained indefinitely, it could putrefy or cause irritation, leading to both physical symptoms and the characteristic fury. The female body in this view possessed an inherent instability directly linked to its reproductive potential, requiring the work of intercourse and childbirth for proper balance and health. Consequently, the most consistently recommended cure offered by Roman physicians for furor uterinus and related complaints was strikingly similar to the Greek prescription, marriage and subsequent childbirth. This wasn't merely advice, it was often presented as a medical necessity, a prescribed duty to restore physiological and emotional equilibrium. Engaging in regular sexual activity was thought to provide the necessary release and prevent the harmful retention of fluids or seed. Pregnancy was seen as the ultimate stabilizer, physically anchoring the womb in its correct position and fulfilling its biological destiny, thereby calming its supposed tendency towards disruptive fury. Childbirth provided a definitive purging or cleansing of the system. This medical prescription perfectly aligned with and reinforced Roman societal expectations, where a woman's primary value and role were often perceived through her ability to bear legitimate children for the family and the state. However, Roman medicine wasn't entirely monolithic. We find more nuanced perspectives from figures like Soranus of Ephesus, a highly influential Greek physician who practiced in Rome during the early 2nd century CE. He specialized in gynecology and obstetrics, and his writings provide valuable insights. While Soranus still operated within the broader framework that linked female health to the uterus, he sometimes offered gentler approaches to managing conditions associated with hysteria or uterine distress. He advised against overly harsh treatments and recognized that factors beyond the purely physical might play a role, even if the ultimate cause was still located in the womb. For instance, he recommended creating a calm and soothing environment for the affected woman. Soranus cautioned against exposing women suffering from these afflictions to strong emotional stimuli, whether excessively joyful or deeply distressing. The thinking was that intense emotions could further agitate the already sensitive uterine system, potentially exacerbating the symptoms. He suggested measures like quiet rest, warm compresses, perhaps gentle massage, and a calm atmosphere. Importantly, Soranus also advised husbands to treat their afflicted wives with gentleness and consideration, recognizing that harshness could worsen their condition. This hints at an awareness, albeit limited, that the woman's environment and interpersonal relationships could influence her well-being, even if the root cause was still believed to be physiological and uterine-based. His approach represented a more compassionate, though still fundamentally flawed, perspective within the prevailing medical understanding. Despite Soranus's calls for gentler care, the actual treatment a Roman woman received likely depended significantly on her social standing. Wealthier women, part of the elite classes, might have had access to physicians like Soranus or their followers. Tent prescriptions could include extended periods of rest in comfortable surroundings, therapeutic bathing in specially prepared waters, professional massage, listening to calming music, or consuming specific foods and wines believed to have soothing properties. These treatments, while still aimed at calming the uterine fury, offered a degree of comfort and personalized attention, Reflecting their privileged status, the focus was on managing the condition within a framework of relative ease. For women of lower social strata, the vast majority of the population, the reality was likely very different. Access to learned physicians was rare and expensive. Their complaints might be addressed through folk remedies passed down through generations, often involving herbal mixtures or simple dietary advice. These remedies might offer some symptomatic relief, but the underlying condition, as understood by the medical elite, remained unaddressed by sophisticated means. In many cases, the symptoms experienced by poorer women, especially if they interfered with their capacity for labor or domestic duties, might simply be dismissed, ignored, or met with the standard, often unhelpful advice to marry, have children, or simply endure. Their suffering was less likely to be validated or receive dedicated therapeutic attention compared to their wealthier counterparts. This entire framework surrounding furor uterinalis exemplifies several critical processes: the medicalization, moralization, and minimization of female distress. It was medicalized because complex experiences, potentially involving anxiety, depression, trauma, or other physical ailments, were reduced to a single diagnosis, rooted firmly in the uterus. This biological explanation overshadowed any potential psychological or social factors. It was moralized because the condition and its cures were intrinsically linked to societal expectations of female behavior, specifically marriage and motherhood. A woman experiencing furor uterinalis might be implicitly or explicitly judged for not fulfilling these roles, her suffering seen as a consequence of this perceived failure. Furthermore, female pain and distress were often minimized. By attributing such a wide array of symptoms to a single, gender-specific cause often seen as inherent to female nature, the depth and legitimacy of individual suffering could be diminished. It became just a case of uterine trouble, something women were perhaps expected to endure or manage through prescribed social roles. This perspective effectively silenced women's own interpretations of their experiences and limited the scope of medical inquiry, preventing a deeper understanding of the diverse factors that contribute to human suffering regardless of gender. The focus remained narrow, confined by assumptions about female biology and its connection to emotional stability. Ultimately, the Roman approach to conditions like furor uterinalis underscores the pervasive societal and medical preoccupation with women's reproductive function as the primary determinant of their health and well-being. While Roman medicine advanced in practical ways, the theoretical understanding of female-specific complaints remained heavily indebted to earlier Greek models, centering almost exclusively on the uterus. Women's bodies and minds were interpreted through the lens of their capacity for childbearing, and their emotional or physical distress was frequently explained away as a malfunction of this system, best rectified by fulfilling their reproductive duties. This persistent focus continued a long silence, obscuring the complex realities of women's lives and anxieties, reducing them to the workings or perceived failings of a single organ. As we drift onwards from Rome, let this thought linger: the enduring power of biological determinism in shaping the understanding and treatment of female distress throughout history. Let us drift forward once more, leaving behind the structured roads and bathhouses of Rome, and float gently into the era known as the Middle Ages. Spanning roughly from the 5th to the 15th century, this was a period of profound transformation in Europe. Following the decline of the Western Roman Empire, societal structures shifted, and the influence of the Christian Church grew immensely, becoming central to daily life, governance, and the understanding of the world. Knowledge from the classical era was often fragmented, preserved in monasteries, but not always widely disseminated or interpreted through the same rational lens. Instead, faith, spirituality, and a keen awareness of the divine and the demonic permeated medieval consciousness, shaping how people understood health, illness, and the human condition itself. Medical knowledge inherited from Greece and Rome did not entirely disappear during this long period, but it often existed alongside and was frequently overshadowed by deeply held religious beliefs. Formal medical practice continued, sometimes within monastic infirmaries where monks preserved and copied ancient texts, or through university-trained physicians in later centuries. However, the interpretation of diseases and their causes was heavily filtered through theology. Illness could be seen as divine punishment for sin, a test of faith sent by God, or the direct result of malicious interference by the devil or his demons. The naturalistic explanations favored by Hippocrates, while perhaps still known to some scholars, often took a backseat to these powerful spiritual frameworks when confronted with baffling or distressing symptoms. Interestingly, the ancient concept of the wandering womb, the restless Hysteria, lingered in the medieval imagination. It wasn't necessarily discarded, but rather absorbed and reinterpreted within the prevailing spiritual worldview. The physical descriptions might persist, the feeling of suffocation, the sudden faintness, but the reason for the womb's supposed migration could now be attributed to supernatural forces. Perhaps sinfulness made the body vulnerable, allowing the womb to become dislodged. Or maybe a demon, seeking to torment a virtuous soul or exploit a sinful one, could physically manipulate the organ, causing it to press against the heart or lungs. The physical ailment described by the ancients became imbued with profound spiritual significance, a battleground for forces of good and evil within the female body. Consequently, symptoms that we might recognize today as related to severe anxiety, panic disorder, or other forms of psychological distress were often interpreted through this spiritual lens. Uncontrollable trembling, sudden fits of weeping, episodes of paralysis or mutism, overwhelming feelings of dread or panic, and seizure-like convulsions, these were frequently viewed with suspicion. Rather than being seen primarily as medical issues, they were often interpreted as signs that the individual was spiritually compromised. Such manifestations could indicate demonic harassment, a state of sinfulness that invited demonic influence, or perhaps even outright possession, where an evil entity was believed to have taken control of the person's body and mind, causing these terrifying outward signs. The belief in the active interference of demons in human affairs was widespread and deeply ingrained in the medieval worldview. Demons were thought to be fallen angels, constantly seeking to tempt, torment, and lead humans astray. They were believed capable of inflicting physical ailments, inciting sinful thoughts, and even entering and controlling human bodies. Therefore, when a woman exhibited dramatic and inexplicable symptoms, particularly those involving loss of control, emotional volatility, or physical contortions, demonic influence became a primary suspect. The suffering individual wasn't just ill, she was potentially engaged in a terrifying spiritual battle, her body the vessel for supernatural conflict, her soul perceived to be in grave danger from these unseen, malevolent forces. Given this understanding, the authority for diagnosing and treating such conditions often fell to the church rather than secular physicians, especially when demonic influence was suspected. A priest or other religious figure might be called upon to assess the situation. Their task was to discern the true nature of the affliction. Was it a natural illness, perhaps requiring traditional remedies? Was it a trial sent by God, requiring patience and prayer? Or was it the work of the devil, requiring spiritual intervention? This discernment might involve questioning the afflicted person and witnesses, observing the symptoms closely for perceived supernatural signs, and engaging in prayer to seek divine guidance. The diagnosis itself became a spiritual process fraught with implications for the sufferer's soul. Once a diagnosis leaning towards spiritual causes was made, the treatments prescribed were predominantly religious in nature. The goal was not simply to alleviate physical symptoms, but to address the perceived underlying spiritual problem, be it sin, demonic harassment, or possession. Common remedies included intensive prayer, the reciting of specific psalms or litanies, frequent confession of sins to purify the soul, and acts of penance such as fasting or charitable works to seek God's forgiveness and favor. Pilgrimages to the shrines of saints known for healing were often recommended, hoping for miraculous intervention. The application of holy water, blessed salt, or contact with sacred relics might also be employed, believing these consecrated items held power against evil forces. In cases where demonic possession was strongly suspected, the rite of exorcism could be performed. This was a formal religious ritual conducted by an authorized priest involving specific prayers, commands in the name of God, and the use of holy objects, all aimed at forcibly expelling the supposed demonic entity from the person's body. Beyond exorcism, isolation was sometimes employed. The afflicted individual might be confined to a room, a convent, or even a designated section of a hospital or asylum, partly to allow for focused prayer and observation, and partly to protect the community from potential spiritual contagion or disruptive behavior. This isolation, however well-intentioned, could also deepen the sufferer's sense of alienation and despair. As the Middle Ages progressed, particularly from the 13th century onwards and intensifying into the early modern period, fears about witchcraft began to escalate dramatically across Europe. This added another sinister layer to the interpretation of women's unexplained illnesses and distress. Women, already viewed through the lens of Eve's perceived weakness and susceptibility to temptation, became disproportionately targeted by witchcraft accusations. Symptoms previously attributed to a wandering womb or general demonic harassment could now be reframed as definitive proof of a pact with the devil, evidence that the woman had willingly given herself over to evil in exchange for supernatural powers, which might manifest as fits, strange utterances, or unusual physical resilience or weakness. The evidence used in witchcraft trials often included precisely the kinds of symptoms associated with severe anxiety, epilepsy, or other neurological and psychological conditions. Convulsions, speaking in languages the person seemingly shouldn't know, glossolalia, possibly linked to dissociative states, inexplicable physical marks or lack of sensation on the body, unusual strength during an episode, or persistent melancholy could all be twisted into signs of demonic allegiance. Even knowledge of traditional herbal remedies long practiced by women as healers within their communities could become suspect. A woman possessing such knowledge might be accused of using her herbs not for healing but for casting harmful spells or creating magical potions, her traditional role suddenly viewed through a lens of malevolent intent. Furthermore, the emotional expression of distress itself could be heavily moralized and viewed with suspicion. Excessive weeping, for example, while sometimes seen as a sign of penitence, could also be interpreted as a dangerous vulnerability, a weakening of the spirit that allowed demons easier access, or even a manipulative performance. Persistent sadness or despair might be condemned as the sin of ascetia, sloth or spiritual apathy, or a lack of trust in God's providence. The very act of suffering intensely, especially in ways that deviated from quiet endurance, could be seen not just as an illness but as a moral or spiritual failing, making the woman culpable for her own condition or the perceived demonic influence it attracted. Pain wasn't just experienced, it was judged. In this environment where spiritual interpretations held sway and fear of demonic influence and witchcraft was rife, some of the methods used to test or treat afflicted individuals could be terrifyingly harsh. Ordeals such as the infamous swimming or dunking of suspected witches were sometimes employed based on the belief that pure water would reject an agent of the devil. While intended as a diagnostic tool or a form of purification, these were often perilous. Similarly, extreme forms of fasting or severe physical penance might be imposed, either voluntarily by the sufferer seeking spiritual relief or by authorities aiming to discipline the body and drive out sin or demons. These measures reflected the gravity with which such conditions were viewed, not just illnesses, but profound spiritual crises with potentially eternal consequences. So, as we conclude our gentle drift through the Middle Ages, we see a world where the understanding of female anxiety and distress was a complex tapestry woven from threads of ancient medical ideas, dominant Christian theology, prevalent folk beliefs, and rising fears of witchcraft. The physical body, particularly the female body centered around the uterus, remained a focal point, but its afflictions were increasingly interpreted as battles within the spiritual realm. Symptoms were read as signs of sin, demonic attack, or divine testing. This often placed women experiencing profound physical or emotional suffering in a perilous position, their pain misunderstood, moralized, and sometimes lethally misinterpreted as evidence of evil. This legacy of spiritualizing distress would cast long shadows, slowly giving way as we move towards new eras of thought, yet leaving an indelible mark on the history of how anxiety in women was perceived and treated. Let us now allow the currents of time to carry us forward, away from the medieval world steeped in overt spiritual explanations and into the vibrant, transformative periods of the Renaissance and the subsequent centuries, often termed the early modern era. This span, roughly from the 15th through the 18th centuries, witnessed a remarkable rebirth, a rediscovery of classical Greek and Roman knowledge, art, and philosophy, and it was also an age of exploration, scientific revolution, and the dawn of the Enlightenment, fostering a renewed emphasis on observation, reason, and understanding the natural world, including the intricate workings of the human body. One might expect this intellectual ferment to rapidly illuminate the nature of human distress, but progress, especially regarding women's emotional health, remained slow and often tethered to older ideas. Indeed, while figures like Vesalius advanced anatomical knowledge and Harvey discovered blood circulation, the application of this new science to the understanding of conditions like anxiety or melancholy in women was often partial or inconsistent. The spirit of inquiry coexisted with deeply entrenched traditional beliefs. The rediscovery of classical medical texts, particularly those of Hippocrates and Galen, paradoxically reinforced some ancient theories, even as new ones began to emerge. For women experiencing what we might now understand as anxiety, panic, or depression, this era brought a complex mix of old and new explanations, and treatments that reflected this blend of tradition and tentative innovation, still heavily filtered through societal expectations of femininity. One persistent thread, woven through medieval times and continuing strongly into this era, was the focus on the uterus. Despite growing anatomical understanding, the womb remained a primary suspect in explaining a wide range of female complaints that lacked obvious physical causes. Physicians and laypeople alike continued to draw connections between a woman's emotional state and her reproductive organs. Anxiety, fainting spells, fits of weeping, or periods of deep sadness could still be attributed to a disordered or idle womb, particularly if the woman deviated from the expected path of marriage and motherhood. The ancient ghost of the wandering womb, though perhaps less literal, still haunted interpretations of female distress, linking it inextricably to biology. Consider, for example, how a young woman's persistent nervousness or unease might be interpreted. If she were unmarried past the typical age, her symptoms could easily be ascribed to the suffering of her unfulfilled reproductive system, her body supposedly yearning for marriage and conception. Similarly, a married woman experiencing panic or deep melancholy might find her condition attributed to difficulties conceiving, irregularities in her menstrual cycle, or a general humoral imbalance thought to originate in or be exacerbated by her womb. The narrative remained stubbornly focused. Female emotional stability was intrinsically linked to the proper functioning and societal utilization of her reproductive capacity. Addressing the anxiety often meant addressing this perceived biological imperative first and foremost. Alongside these uterine theories, the dominant medical framework throughout much of this period was humoralism, derived from the ancient Greek physician Galen. This theory proposed that the human body contained 4 essential fluids, or humors: blood, associated with warmth and moisture, sanguine, temperament; phlegm, cold and moist, choleric; yellow bile or choler, warm and dry, choleric; and black bile or melancholy, cold and dry, melancholy. Health was believed to depend on the perfect balance of these 4 humors. Illness, including emotional and mental distress, was thought to arise from an imbalance, an excess or deficiency of one or more humors, or their corruption within the body. This elegant, comprehensive system offered explanations for nearly every ailment. Humoral theory was also used to explain differences in temperament, often along gendered lines. Women were frequently characterized as being naturally colder and moister than men, which, according to humoral logic, made them constitutionally more prone to an excess of phlegm or potentially black bile. This inherent humoral makeup was thought to predispose women towards passivity, emotional sensitivity, and conditions like melancholy, a state of profound sadness, lethargy, and sometimes anxiety, attributed specifically to an overabundance of cold, dark black bile. Thus, female emotional distress was not only linked to the uterus, but also explained by an innate gender-specific humoral constitution that supposedly made them more vulnerable. Given this framework, treatments logically aimed at restoring humoral balance. If distress was caused by an excess of a particular humor, the primary therapeutic strategy was depletion, removing the offending fluid from the body. If it was caused by corrupt humors, methods aimed at purification were employed. This approach applied to a vast range of conditions, from fevers to infections to emotional disturbances. For anxiety, agitation, or melancholy, treatments would focus on identifying the presumed humoral imbalance, perhaps too much hot blood causing agitation or too much cold black bile causing sadness, and then attempting to correct it through various, often quite taxing, physical interventions designed to drain or purge the excess. One of the most common treatments derived from humoral theory was bloodletting or venesection. This involved intentionally opening a vein, typically in the arm, and draining a specific quantity of blood. The rationale was that removing excess blood could cool the body, reduce feverishness, calm agitation, or alleviate plethora, a perceived state of having too much blood, thought to cause pressure and distress. For women experiencing anxiety, mania, or even intense sadness, sometimes attributed to overly hot or abundant blood, bloodletting was a standard prescription. The procedure itself, while potentially weakening, was seen as a necessary step to reestablish the body's delicate internal equilibrium, a physical solution for both physical and emotional turmoil. Other methods of humoral depletion were also widely practiced. Purging, using strong laxatives, purgatives, or vomiting, inducing substances, emetics, was intended to cleanse the body of corrupt or excessive humors, particularly bile, believed to accumulate in the digestive system. Leeches were frequently applied to specific parts of the body for more localized bloodletting, thought to draw out bad blood or reduce inflammation near a particular organ. These treatments, aiming for purification and balance, could be physically exhausting and sometimes dangerous, yet they remained staples of medical practice for centuries, applied to women suffering from emotional distress just as they were for countless other ailments, all under the banner of restoring humoral harmony. However, beginning notably in the 17th century and gaining more prominence in the 18th, a new explanatory framework began to emerge alongside humoralism, the concept of nerves. Physicians like Thomas Willis made significant advances in understanding the brain and nervous system. Increasingly, attention shifted towards the nerves as transmitters of sensation and mediators of emotion. Disorders that were difficult to explain solely through humoral imbalances began to be attributed to problems within the nervous system itself, a weakness, an oversensitivity, or a disorder of the nerves. This marked a slow but significant shift towards a more neurocentric view of health and illness, including mental and emotional states. This emerging focus on nerves quickly developed a distinctly gendered dimension. Women were widely perceived by physicians and society as possessing inherently weaker, more delicate, and more easily disturbed nervous systems than men. Their nervous fibers were thought to be finer, more sensitive, and more susceptible to external stimuli and internal emotional fluctuations. This perceived constitutional fragility made women supposedly more prone to a range of nervous disorders. While men could also suffer from nervous complaints, the condition was often seen as almost characteristic of the female sex, a natural consequence of their supposedly more fragile biological makeup. Female sensitivity, once perhaps praised in moderation, became medicalized as a source of pathology. These nervous disorders encompassed a wide array of symptoms, often vague and overlapping. Descriptions abound in medical texts and personal writings of the era, referring to conditions like the vapors, a term often used to describe feelings of faintness, dizziness, shortness of breath, or ill-defined malaise thought to rise from the stomach or chest, clouding the mind. Other common symptoms included palpitations, tremors, chronic fatigue or lassitude, heightened sensitivity to noise or light, excessive weeping, feelings of anxiety or dread, digestive complaints, and general emotional instability. These were all bundled together under the umbrella of weak nerves or nervous sensibility, a catch-all diagnosis for unexplained female distress. The perceived causes of these nervous afflictions were equally varied. Overstimulation was frequently blamed, too much socializing, attending crowded balls, reading stimulating or emotionally charged novels, even engaging in intellectual pursuits deemed too taxing for the female mind. Conversely, lack of stimulation, boredom, loneliness, or a sedentary lifestyle often prescribed could also be implicated. Emotional shocks, such as grief, disappointment in love, financial worries, or domestic strife, were considered potent triggers for nervous collapse. Underlying it all was the recurring theme of inherent female delicacy, making women vulnerable to the stresses and strains of life in ways men supposedly were not. Consequently, treatments for nervous disorders focused primarily on calming and strengthening this supposedly fragile nervous system. Rest was paramount. Severe cases might involve a rest cure, confining the woman to bed for weeks or even months, minimizing all physical activity and sensory input. Less extreme prescriptions involved avoiding social engagements, limiting visitors, and seeking quiet, peaceful surroundings. Warm baths were often recommended for their soothing effect. Gentle, non-strenuous exercise, such as slow walks in the garden or carriage rides in the country air, was permitted, but anything potentially exciting or jarring was strictly forbidden. The goal was to shield the delicate nerves from any further agitation. Alongside these environmental and behavioral approaches, pharmacological interventions became increasingly popular, particularly the use of laudanum. This potent mixture, typically tincture of opium dissolved in alcohol, was readily available from apothecaries and widely prescribed by physicians from the 17th century onwards. It was hailed as a near panacea for a vast range of ailments, but it found particular favor in treating nervous complaints due to its powerful sedative and analgesic effects. Laudanum could effectively quiet anxiety, dull emotional pains, suppress coughs, alleviate physical discomfort, and induce sleep, making it seem like an ideal remedy for the agitated nerves and vague malaise suffered by many women. The ease of access and perceived effectiveness led to widespread laudanum use, often prescribed liberally and taken regularly over long periods, especially by women of the middle and upper classes seeking relief from nervous symptoms, menstrual pain, or the general stresses of life. Physicians praised its ability to bring tranquility and restore order to disordered nerves. However, the highly addictive nature of opium was poorly understood or often downplayed. Many individuals, particularly women for whom it was so frequently prescribed, developed dependence, finding themselves trapped in a cycle of needing the drug to function or simply to avoid the agonies of withdrawal, a hidden epidemic beneath the surface of respectable society. For women of means suffering from persistent nervous complaints, more specialized treatments became available. Visits to fashionable spa towns like Bath in England or Baden-Baden in Germany were highly popular. Taking the waters, both by drinking mineral-rich spring water and bathing in it, was believed to have restorative effects on the nerves and overall constitution. Additionally, private retreats, sanatoria, or nervous homes began to emerge, offering structured environments dedicated to treating nervous invalids. These institutions provided separation from the stresses of home life and enforced regimens of rest, diet, and gentle therapies under medical supervision, catering specifically to the affluent clientele who could afford such care. The environment within these retreats and the advice given to nervous women generally emphasized tranquility and the avoidance of stimulation. Daily routines were often strictly regimented, involving set times for rest, meals usually bland and simple, gentle hydrotherapy, perhaps light occupational therapy like needlework, and minimal social interaction. Crucially, intellectual activity was often discouraged. Patients might be forbidden from reading newspapers, engaging novels, or complex literature. Deep thinking, strenuous study, or participation in serious conversation were seen as detrimental, potentially overexciting the already taxed nervous system. The ideal state was one of passive recuperation, mental as well as physical. This pervasive advice to limit intellectual engagement highlights a significant aspect of how female distress was managed during this era. While the Enlightenment celebrated reason and intellectual pursuit as the highest human faculties, this was often implicitly or explicitly framed as a male domain. For women suffering from nerves, the mind itself could be seen as part of the problem, a source of potentially harmful overstimulation. Engaging it too deeply was thought to risk further destabilizing their delicate constitution. The recommended path to recovery often involved quieting the mind, limiting its scope, and encouraging passive acceptance rather than active intellectual or emotional engagement with their experiences or the world around them. In more severe or persistent cases, or when a woman's behavior was deemed disruptive or unmanageable within the domestic sphere, confinement became an option. Unlike the formal legal processes sometimes required for confining men deemed insane, women could occasionally be placed in private madhouses or asylums with less stringent oversight, sometimes at the behest of husbands or families. While intended perhaps for safety or intensive treatment, this represented the ultimate form of control, removing the woman entirely from society and silencing her distress within institutional walls, reflecting the limited agency afforded to women, especially those perceived as mentally or emotionally unstable. Reflecting on this period from the Renaissance through the 18th century, we observe a fascinating yet troubling landscape. There was undeniable intellectual progress, a growing understanding of human anatomy and physiology, and the beginnings of a shift towards neurocentric explanations for distress. Yet these advancements were consistently filtered through enduring biases about female nature, rooted in ancient uterine theories, humoral concepts of innate weakness, and emerging ideas about delicate nerves. While men were encouraged towards reason and mastery, women experiencing anxiety or distress were often directed towards rest, sedation, intellectual passivity, and management rather than deeper understanding or empowerment. The legacy of this era is complex. On one hand, the focus shifted partially away from purely spiritual explanations towards biological and physiological ones, paving the way for future medical approaches. On the other hand, these biological explanations were deeply gendered, often reinforcing notions of female inferiority and fragility. The widespread use of sedatives like laudanum provided temporary relief for some, but created cycles of dependence for others. Ultimately, many women continued to suffer privately, their anxieties and sorrows managed with rest cures, soothing draughts, or simple dismissal, their inner lives often obscured behind the expected facade of feminine composure and domesticity. This complex inheritance sets the stage for the developments of the 19th century, an era that would both challenge and perpetuate these ideas in new ways. Let us gently drift now into the heart of the 19th century, the era often named for Britain's long-reigning monarch, Queen Victoria. Stretching roughly from the 1830s to the dawn of the 20th century, this was a time of immense change, rapid industrialization transforming landscapes and societies, groundbreaking scientific discoveries reshaping understanding of the world, and the expansion of empires across the globe. Yet, alongside this progress, Victorian society, particularly in Britain and America, became known for its strict social codes, its emphasis on propriety, moral earnestness, and a distinct set of expectations regarding behavior and emotional expression, especially within the middle and upper classes. This complex environment profoundly shaped how anxiety and distress, particularly in women, were understood and treated. The prevailing emotional climate, especially for women of a certain social standing, emphasized restraint and composure. Outward displays of strong emotion, whether anger, intense grief, or even exuberant joy, were often discouraged as unladylike or disruptive. Women were largely confined to the domestic sphere, idealized as angels in the house, responsible for maintaining moral purity and emotional tranquility within the home. This pressure to conform to an ideal of serene domesticity meant that expressing feelings of anxiety, frustration, sadness, or discontent could be difficult, often leading to the suppression or internalization of such emotions, creating a fertile ground for misunderstood distress to manifest in other ways. In this context, the diagnoses of nervous disorders or melancholy that we saw in previous centuries began to coalesce and were frequently subsumed under the extraordinarily broad and pervasive diagnosis of hysteria. While the term had ancient roots, it experienced a major resurgence in the 19th century, becoming an almost ubiquitous label applied to women exhibiting a bewildering array of symptoms. It was discussed widely in medical literature, featured in popular discourse, and became a common explanation for almost any deviation from the expected norm of calm, controlled femininity. Being diagnosed with hysteria became in some circles almost a marker of delicate sensibility, yet it carried significant risks of misunderstanding and mismanagement. The list of symptoms attributed to Victorian hysteria was vast and remarkably diverse, making it a true diagnostic catch-all. It could include physical complaints like fainting spells, shortness of breath, temporary paralysis or numbness in limbs, unexplained pains, digestive upsets, fatigue, and insomnia. It also encompassed emotional and behavioral symptoms such as anxiety attacks, fits of weeping or laughter, irritability, dramatic mood swings, mutism, loss of appetite, heightened sensitivity, and behaviors perceived as attention-seeking or manipulative. Essentially, any physical or emotional suffering in a woman that lacked a clear organic cause could potentially be labeled as hysteria, a condition thought to be uniquely, or at least predominantly, female. Despite the growing sophistication of medicine in other areas, the precise cause of hysteria remained elusive and highly debated throughout the Victorian era. While the direct link to a wandering womb became less literal, the female reproductive system was still frequently implicated, with theories linking hysteria to menstrual irregularities, ovarian problems, or sexual frustration or excess. Simultaneously, the focus on the nervous system intensified. Hysteria was increasingly viewed as a functional disorder of the nerves, a sign of instability or weakness within the complex neural pathways governing emotion and sensation. Yet tangible proof remained lacking, leaving the condition open to interpretation based on prevailing social and medical biases. Amidst this landscape, one figure emerged as particularly influential in the treatment of nervous disorders, especially hysteria: Dr. Silas Weir Mitchell, a respected American neurologist based in Philadelphia. Being active in the latter half of the 19th century, Mitchell gained international renown for his work on nerve injuries and diseases, and he turned his attention particularly to the treatment of neurasthenia, nervous exhaustion, and hysteria, conditions he frequently encountered in his affluent female patients. He developed a specific therapeutic regimen that would become incredibly famous, widely adopted, and deeply controversial: the rest cure. Mitchell first developed aspects of his treatment while working with exhausted soldiers during the American Civil War, but he adapted and refined it primarily for women suffering from nervous conditions. The rest cure, as he detailed in publications like Fat and Blood, 1877, gained immense popularity both in America and Europe. It was seen by many physicians as a logical, scientific approach to restoring depleted nerve force and calming overwrought systems. Prescribed primarily to middle and upper-class women whose families could afford the lengthy and intensive treatment, the rest cure became the standard of care for severe hysteria and nervous prostration for several decades, a hallmark of late Victorian medical practice. The absolute cornerstone of the rest cure was prolonged and enforced bed rest. Patients were typically confined to bed for 6 to 8 weeks, sometimes considerably longer depending on the severity of their case and their response to treatment. In the initial stages, this rest was absolute. The patient was not allowed to sit up, feed herself, or even turn over in bed without assistance from a nurse. She was expected to remain as physically inactive as possible, the goal being to conserve every ounce of energy and prevent any expenditure of the precious nerve force that Mitchell believed had been depleted by the illness or by modern life's demands. Equally crucial to the regimen was strict isolation. The patient was removed from her familiar home environment and often placed under the care of a specially trained nurse, ideally a stranger, in a rented room or sometimes a hospital setting. Contact with family and friends was severely restricted, especially early in the treatment. Husbands, children, and companions were typically forbidden from visiting. Correspondence, both receiving and writing letters, was usually prohibited. This isolation was intended to remove the patient from all sources of emotional excitement, worry, or familiar demands, creating a controlled environment free from external stressors that might agitate her nerves. Furthermore, the rest cure involved a strict prohibition on almost all forms of mental activity or stimulation, reading books or newspapers, engaging in writing, pursuing hobbies like sewing or drawing, and sometimes even engaging in conversation, particularly about her symptoms or feelings, were forbidden. The physician aimed for complete mental emptiness, alongside physical stillness. The patient was expected to exist in a state of passive receptivity, her mind quieted, her thoughts undirected. Any activity perceived as intellectually or emotionally taxing was seen as counterproductive to the goal of restoring nervous energy through absolute repose. To counteract the potential negative physical effects of prolonged immobility and to actively build the patient's strength, the rest cure included specific physical interventions. Central to this was forced or strongly encouraged feeding, often involving a diet extremely rich in fat and calories. Patients were given large quantities of milk, up to 4 pints a day, eggs, broth, and other easily digestible but highly nourishing foods, sometimes spoon-fed by the. The aim was to rapidly increase body weight, which Mitchell associated with improved health and replenished nerve capital. Gaining weight became a key indicator of the cure's success. In addition to the high-calorie diet, passive physical treatments were employed daily. Skilled massage was administered for an hour or more each day by the nurse. This was intended to maintain muscle tone, improve circulation, aid digestion, and provide some sensory input without requiring active effort from the patient. Often this was supplemented by the use of mild electrical currents, phoradization, applied to various muscle groups. This too was meant to stimulate the muscles passively and perhaps exert a tonic effect on the nerves themselves, all while the patient remained completely at rest, her body being acted upon rather than acting. Mitchell's rationale for this intensive and controlling regimen was multifaceted. On a physiological level, he believed that conditions like hysteria stemmed from a profound depletion of nerve force or energy. The absolute rest conserved this energy. The rich diet replenished bodily reserves, fat and blood, and the isolation removed draining stimuli. The passive massage and electricity supposedly helped rebuild the system without taxing it. The cure was designed as a period of intensive physical and nervous system regeneration, allowing the body's depleted resources to be fully restored through enforced inactivity and nourishment. However, underlying the physiological rationale was a powerful psychological component. Mitchell believed that many hysterical women suffered from a lack of discipline and an overly sensitive, self-absorbed nature. The rest cure, with its rigid rules, isolation, and dependence on the physician and nurse, was explicitly designed to break the patient's will, overcome her resistance, which was often seen as part of the pathology, and induce a state of childlike obedience and passivity. While placing the patient in a situation of complete powerlessness, the physician aimed to reassert control and reshape her habits of thought and behavior, essentially re-educating her nervous system and her character through enforced submission. This aspect of breaking the will meant that patient resistance was often interpreted negatively. If a woman complained about the confinement, the isolation, the forced feeding, or the lack of activity, or if her symptoms seemed to worsen under the cure, it was frequently seen not as a sign that the treatment was inappropriate or harmful, but as evidence of her underlying hysterical nature. Her stubbornness, her manipulativeness, her unwillingness to submit to the necessary discipline for recovery. Such resistance might lead the physician to intensify the cure, prolong its duration, or become even more authoritarian, convinced that only complete surrender would lead to healing. One of the most poignant and powerful critiques of the rest cure came from a woman who experienced it firsthand, the American writer and feminist Charlotte Perkins Gilman. Suffering from severe depression and anxiety after the birth of her daughter, what might today be diagnosed as postpartum depression, Gilman consulted Dr. Weir Mitchell himself. In the 1880s, he prescribed a modified version of his rest cure, advising her to live as domestic a life as possible, have her child with her at all times, lie down for an hour after each meal, and crucially, never touch pen, brush, or pencil as long as you live. Gilman attempted to follow Mitchell's advice, abandoning her intellectual and creative pursuits and immersing herself in domesticity. However, she found that the enforced idleness and prohibition on writing drove her so near the borderline of utter mental ruin that she ultimately rejected the treatment. The experience profoundly affected her, highlighting the dangers of a cure that disregarded the patient's intellectual needs and inner life, particularly for a creative and intelligent woman whose sense of self was tied to her work. She later credited defying Mitchell's advice with saving her sanity. Her harrowing experience provided the direct inspiration for her famous short story, The Yellow Wallpaper, first published in 1892. Written in the first person, the story chronicles the experience of a woman confined to an upstairs room in a rented summer house by her physician husband, who is treating her for a temporary nervous depression. a slight hysterical tendency. Following principles similar to the rest cure, he forbids her from working and encourages complete rest and minimal stimulation. Isolated and infantilized, the narrator becomes increasingly obsessed with the room's disturbing yellow wallpaper, eventually descending into psychosis, believing a woman is trapped within the wallpaper pattern and that she must free her. The yellow wallpaper stands as a powerful indictment of the rest cure and the medical attitudes towards women's mental health prevalent at the time. It vividly portrays the potentially devastating psychological effects of enforced passivity, intellectual deprivation, and the dismissal of a patient's own perceptions and feelings. Gilman explicitly stated she wrote it to expose the dangers of treatments like Mitchell's and to save others from similar experiences. So the story resonated deeply and remains a classic of feminist literature, illustrating the potential for supposed cures to become instruments of oppression when they fail to acknowledge the patient's full humanity. While the rest cure was widely prescribed, it was generally reserved for those who could afford the intensive private care involved. For women whose families could not afford such treatment, or whose symptoms were deemed too severe, chronic, or disruptive for management at home or via the rest cure, the insane asylum remained a prominent feature of the Victorian landscape. The 19th century saw a significant expansion in the number and size of public and private asylums, institutions intended to house and treat the growing population diagnosed with various forms of mental illness, including severe hysteria. The conditions within these institutions varied greatly, but many faced challenges of overcrowding and understaffing. Treatments aimed at managing patients and alleviating symptoms often included methods that seem harsh today. Hydrotherapy was widely used, encompassing a range of techniques from prolonged soaking in warm baths, believed to be calming, to the application of cold water douches, wet sheet packs, wrapping the patient tightly in cold, wet sheets, or even immersion in ice baths, thought to shock the system into a calmer state. Early forms of electricotherapy were also employed, applying electrical currents to the head or body. Physical restraints such as straitjackets, cuffs, or confinement in seclusion rooms were used to manage agitated or violent behavior. Entry into these institutions, or even just receiving a diagnosis of hysteria requiring strict management like the rest cure, could sometimes be precipitated by behaviors that simply deviated from the narrow confines of acceptable Victorian femininity. While genuine and severe suffering certainly led many women to treatment, the historical record also suggests that expressing strong opinions countered to male authority, exhibiting passionate emotions, whether grief or anger, talking too rapidly or loudly, showing too much interest in intellectual pursuits deemed unfeminine, or even prolonged weeping, could be interpreted by physicians or concerned families as signs of nervous instability or burgeoning hysteria, potentially justifying intervention or confinement. Throughout this era, there remained a striking lack of focus within mainstream medicine on exploring the potential underlying psychosocial causes of women's distress. While physicians meticulously documented symptoms and debated the merits of various physical treatments like the rest cure or hydrotherapy, they often paid little attention to the social realities of women's lives, the severe limitations on their education and careers, their lack of legal or economic autonomy, the pressures of rigid social expectations, the prevalence of unhappy marriages or domestic abuse, the grief from frequent childbirth and high infant mortality rates, or the frustration of suppressed intellectual and creative desires. These factors were rarely considered central to the etiology or treatment of hysteria. Instead, the Victorian era placed immense pressure on women to embody an idealized image, the angel in the house, a term popularized by a famous poem. This ideal woman was expected to be pious, pure, submissive, devoted to her husband and children, and perpetually calm and cheerful, managing the home flawlessly while providing gentle moral guidance. This impossible standard created a significant disconnect between the expected facade and the often difficult realities of women's lives. Maintaining this facade often required hiding or suppressing genuine feelings of anxiety, sadness, anger, or discontent, lest they be seen as personal failings or signs of illness. In conclusion, as we gently recede from the Victorian age, we leave behind an era where anxiety and distress in women were frequently diagnosed as hysteria and managed through treatments like the highly structured controlling rest cure. While often presented with scientific justification focused on nerves and physical depletion, these approaches frequently reinforced societal norms that demanded female passivity and submission. Critiques like Gilman's The Yellow Wallpaper exposed the potential harm in silencing women's experiences and intellectual lives. Despite the era's scientific progress, much female suffering remained misunderstood, managed rather than explored, and often hidden behind the heavy velvet curtains of Victorian propriety, a poignant legacy leading into the dawn of the 20th century. Let us gently turn the page of history now, moving out of the heavy drapery and gaslight of the Victorian era and into the dawning light of the 20th century. This period, encompassing the early decades from the 1900s through the tumultuous years of the First World War and its aftermath, brought profound shifts in society, technology, art, and thought. Old certainties began to crumble, attitudes towards authority and tradition evolved, and new, sometimes radical ways of understanding the world and the human condition started to emerge. Amidst this ferment, the understanding and treatment of anxiety and emotional distress, particularly in women, underwent another significant transformation, moving away from nerves and wombs towards the complexities of the inner mind. As the 20th century unfolded, the diagnosis of hysteria, that vast and vague category which had dominated discussions of female distress in the previous century, began a slow decline. Critiques of its overuse, the lack of clear pathology, and the often punitive nature of treatments like the rest cure contributed to its waning influence. And while the term didn't vanish overnight, the stage was set for new models of understanding psychological suffering. Models that sought explanations not in faulty organs or depleted nerve force, but within the intricate landscape of the human psyche itself. A revolution in thinking about the mind was brewing, one that would profoundly reshape the conversation around anxiety. At the forefront of this revolution stood Sigmund Freud, a Viennese neurologist working at the turn of the century. Freud, through meticulous clinical observation and bold theoretical leaps, developed psychoanalysis, a groundbreaking psychological theory and therapeutic method. He proposed that human behavior, thoughts, and emotions were powerfully influenced by forces operating outside of conscious awareness. His ideas, though controversial then and now, offered a radically different lens through which to view conditions like anxiety, phobias, obsessions, and the lingering symptoms previously labeled as hysteria, shifting the focus decisively from the physical body to the hidden depths of the mind. Central to Freud's theory was the concept of the unconscious mind. He envisioned the mind not as a single, unified entity, but as having different levels of awareness. The unconscious, he proposed, was a vast reservoir containing thoughts, feelings, memories, desires, and impulses that are hidden from our conscious knowledge, often because they are deemed unacceptable, threatening, or painful. Despite being hidden, Freud believed these unconscious contents constantly strive for expression and exert a significant, often unseen, influence on our conscious experiences, motivations, and emotional states, including feelings of anxiety or distress. This represented a fundamental paradigm shift in understanding psychological suffering. For centuries, as we've seen, explanations for women's anxiety often centered on their physical bodies, the wandering womb of the ancients, the humoral imbalances, the delicate nerves of the 18th century, or the vaguely disordered reproductive system still implicated in Victorian hysteria. Psychoanalysis dramatically relocated the source of the problem. Symptoms were now interpreted not as signs of physical malfunction, but as symbolic expressions of unresolved conflicts, repressed memories, or forbidden desires buried deep within the patient's unconscious mind. The body might express the distress, but the origin lay in the psyche. A key concept in understanding how the unconscious influences distress was repression. Freud proposed that repression is an unconscious defense mechanism the mind uses to protect itself. When thoughts, memories, or desires are too painful, shameful, or incompatible with our conscious self-image or societal rules, the mind pushes them down into the unconscious, effectively forgetting them on a conscious level. However, Freud believed that repressed material doesn't simply disappear. It remains active in the unconscious, seeking release and potentially causing psychological symptoms, including anxiety, as it presses against the barriers of repression. Within this framework, anxiety itself took on new meaning. Freud theorized about anxiety in various ways throughout his career, but often viewed it as a crucial signal. It could be signal anxiety, an unconscious warning sign that dangerous, repressed impulses, often aggressive or sexual, are threatening to break through into conscious awareness, prompting the ego to strengthen its defenses. Alternatively, anxiety could be seen as the result of psychic energy, libido, becoming detached from a repressed idea or impulse and manifesting as freeloading fear or tension. In either case, anxiety was understood as intimately linked to the dynamics of repression and unconscious conflict. Freud placed enormous emphasis on the formative power of early childhood experiences in shaping the adult personality and predisposing individuals to later psychological difficulties. He proposed a series of psychosexual stages, oral, anal, phallic, latency, genital, through which children normally progress. He believed that conflicts, traumas, or excessive gratification or frustration during these critical early stages could lead to fixations, where psychic energy becomes locked, potentially creating vulnerabilities that could surface as neurotic symptoms, including anxiety disorders, in later life under stress. The roots of adult suffering, Freud argued, were often traceable back to the nursery. Perhaps the most famous and controversial aspects of Freud's developmental theory were the Oedipus complex and its less developed female counterpart, sometimes called the Electra complex. He posited that during the phallic stage around ages 3-6, children experience unconscious desires for the parent of the opposite sex and feelings of rivalry and hostility towards the parent of the same sex. How these intense, conflicted feelings were navigated and resolved, Freud believed, had profound consequences for later identity formation, relationships, and psychological health. Unresolved Oedipal or Electra conflicts were seen as a major source of unconscious guilt and anxiety in adulthood. It is important to note the strong emphasis classical Freudian theory placed on sexuality, or libido, as the fundamental psychic energy driving behavior and development. Many unconscious conflicts were interpreted through a psychosexual lens, and symptoms were often seen as disguised expressions of repressed sexual desires or anxieties related to early sexual development. This focus, while groundbreaking and challenging Victorian prudery, also led to critiques, particularly regarding its application to female psychology, sometimes reducing complex emotional experiences primarily to issues of sexual development or frustration, as defined by male theorists. To access and resolve these unconscious conflicts, Freud developed the psychoanalytic method, famously dubbed the talking cure by one of his early patients. This marked a radical departure from the physical interventions of the past. Instead of rest cures, hydrotherapy, or medication, though medication might still be used adjunctively, the primary tool of psychoanalysis was language. The therapy involved regular sessions, often several times a week, where the patient explored their thoughts, feelings, memories, and dreams through talking, guided by the analyst's interpretations aimed at uncovering unconscious material. The typical setting became iconic, the patient reclining comfortably on a couch, often facing away from the analyst who sat behind them. This arrangement was intended to facilitate relaxation, reduce the patient's self-consciousness or inhibition that might come from direct eye contact, and encourage a state of freeloading attention where thoughts and feelings could emerge more spontaneously. The couch became a powerful symbol of this new introspective approach to healing, a space dedicated to exploring the hidden landscapes of the inner world through words. A core technique used on the couch was free association. Patients were encouraged to say whatever came into their mind, no matter how trivial, embarrassing, illogical, or irrelevant it might seem. The idea was to bypass the conscious mind's usual censorship and allow unconscious thoughts, memories, and connections to surface through this uncensored stream of talk. The analyst would listen intently to these associations, looking for recurring themes, patterns, slips of the tongue, or sudden blocks that might indicate areas of underlying conflict or resistance. Dream analysis was another cornerstone of the psychoanalytic method. Freud famously called dreams the royal road to the unconscious, believing that during sleep the mind's defenses are lowered, allowing repressed wishes and conflicts to emerge in disguised, symbolic form. Patients would recount their dreams, and through analyzing the manifest content, the remembered dream, and using free association to explore its elements, the analyst and patient would work towards uncovering the latent content, the hidden unconscious meaning and wishes, expressed symbolically in the dream. The psychoanalyst's role in this process was primarily interpretive and relatively neutral. They listened carefully, offering interpretations about the potential unconscious meanings behind the patient's words, dreams, behaviors, and relationship patterns, particularly as they manifested in the therapeutic relationship itself, transference. The goal of these interpretations was not to provide advice or direct solutions, but to help the patient gain insight into their own unconscious processes, understand the historical roots of their conflicts, and gradually work through repressed material, thereby alleviating symptoms like anxiety. Compared to the often harsh and coercive treatments of the past, the bloodletting, the purges, the dunkings, the forced confinement and silencing of the rest cure, psychoanalysis represented a significantly more humane approach. It centered on listening to the patient, valuing their unique personal history and inner life, and engaging them in a collaborative process of exploration through dialogue. It avoided physical violence and acknowledged the reality and importance of psychological suffering, offering hope for understanding and change through self-reflection rather than mere physical management. However, while the locus of blame shifted away from faulty physical organs, a more subtle form of blame could still persist within the psychoanalytic framework. The source of the patient's suffering, their anxiety, their depression, their hysterical symptoms, was now located deep within their own psyche. It stemmed from their unresolved childhood conflicts, their repressed desires, their inadequate defense mechanisms. The problem was framed as fundamentally internal to the individual, a product of their personal history and psychological makeup. This strong internal focus, while valuable for understanding individual dynamics, sometimes had the effect of minimizing or overlooking the significant impact of external reality on a person's well-being. Societal pressures, restrictive gender roles, economic hardship, lack of education or opportunity, experiences of discrimination or living in abusive or invalidating environments, these external factors, which undoubtedly contribute to anxiety and distress, could be downplayed or reinterpreted primarily as triggers for pre-existing internal conflicts, rather than being seen as significant causes in their own right. The societal context sometimes faded into the background. Furthermore, the concept of resistance, which Freud considered an inevitable part of therapy as the patient unconsciously defends against confronting painful material, could function similarly to earlier interpretations of patient noncompliance. If a patient disagreed with an analyst's interpretation, felt the therapy wasn't helping, or expressed frustration, it could be labeled as resistance, proof of their defensiveness and unwillingness to face unconscious truths. This could suddenly place the responsibility for lack of progress back onto the patient, echoing how resistance to the rest cure was seen as evidence of the patient's stubbornness. Despite these potential pitfalls and ongoing debates, psychoanalysis rapidly gained influence throughout the first half of the 20th century. Its ideas permeated psychiatry and clinical psychology, offering the first comprehensive theory of personality and system of psychotherapy. Its concepts also seeped into Western culture, influencing art, literature, film, and popular understandings of human motivation, dreams, and the significance of childhood. For many, psychoanalysis became the definitive modern approach to understanding the troubled mind, replacing older models based on biology or spirituality. It's crucial to remember, however, that the foundational theories of psychoanalysis were developed predominantly by men, led by Freud himself, working within a specific European cultural context. Their clinical experience and theoretical formulations were inevitably shaped by their own perspectives and the societal norms of their time. This led to significant critiques, particularly from feminist thinkers later in the century, regarding how female psychology was understood and interpreted within this framework, which often seemed to take male development as the standard. Specifically, concepts developed to explain female psychology such as penis envy, the idea that girls experience anxiety and envy upon realizing they lack a penis, impacting their development, or the details of the Electra complex, have been criticized as reflecting male biases and failing to adequately capture the complexities of female experience and identity development. The heavy emphasis on libido and psychosexual stages, derived largely from a male model, was seen by some as reducing female motivations and distress too narrowly to issues related to sexuality or their relationships with men and parents. And this tendency towards reductionism could sometimes be seen in how women's anxieties or relationship problems were explained, both within some psychoanalytic circles and especially in popularized versions of the theory. Complex issues might be traced back simplistically to unresolved Electra complexes or inadequate identification with the mother, or attributed wholesale to daddy issues, a catch-all phrase implying that a woman's difficulties stemmed primarily from a troubled relationship with her father, overlooking other contributing factors in her life and personality. This raises a critical question that hovered around the edges of the psychoanalytic revolution and gained more traction later. Was it possible, within this dominant framework focused on internal, often childhood-rooted unconscious conflict, for a woman to experience anxiety simply because her life circumstances were objectively difficult, stressful, or limiting? Could anxiety be a rational response to external pressures, gender inequality, lack of fulfillment, or existential concerns, without automatically being interpreted as a sign of individual neurosis, repressed desires, or arrested psychological development? In summary, the early 20th century, under the profound influence of Sigmund Freud and psychoanalysis, marked a pivotal shift in understanding anxiety in women. The focus moved decisively from the body to the mind, from physical defects to unconscious conflicts. The talking cure offered a less physically violent approach, valuing personal history and inner life. Yet, by locating the problem primarily within the individual's psyche and interpreting experiences through specific theoretical lenses often developed by men, psychoanalysis also introduced new, more subtle ways of potentially blaming the sufferer and sometimes minimized the impact of external realities. This complex legacy, acknowledging psychic pain while potentially internalizing its cause, set the stage for the diverse therapeutic landscape and ongoing critiques of the later 20th century and beyond. Let us drift now into the middle decades of the 20th century, particularly the period following the Second World War. As soldiers returned home and economies boomed, especially in North America, a new domestic landscape emerged. This was the era of suburban expansion, rising consumerism, and a powerful cultural narrative centered on the nuclear family. Television screens began flickering in living rooms, often portraying idealized images of family life, where fathers went off to work and mothers presided serenely over spotless homes filled with modern appliances and happy children. This vision of domestic bliss became a pervasive cultural ideal, shaping expectations for a generation. Beneath this carefully polished surface of post-war prosperity and suburban tranquility, however, other currents flowed. While many undoubtedly found contentment, the era also harbored unspoken anxieties and dissatisfactions, particularly for women, whose lives were often expected to conform rigidly to the role of housewife and mother. The image of the perpetually cheerful, fulfilled homemaker effortlessly managing her domain often masked a more complex reality of isolation, boredom, frustration, or the simple exhaustion that came with demanding, often undervalued domestic labor performed within the confines of the suburban home. The societal pressure on women during the 1950s and early 1960s to find complete fulfillment within the domestic sphere was immense. Education, especially higher education for women, might be seen primarily as preparation for finding a suitable husband and becoming a capable homemaker and hostess. Careers outside the home were often discouraged or seen as secondary to marital and maternal duties. Deviation from this script or expressing unhappiness with it could be interpreted not as a critique of the role itself, but as a personal inadequacy, a failure to adjust to what was presented as a natural and desirable state for women. It was into this specific cultural context that a new class of medications arrived and rapidly gained extraordinary popularity: the minor tranquilizer. Beginning in the mid-1950s with meprobamate, marketed under brand names like Miltown and Equinil, and followed swiftly by the even more effective and widely prescribed benzodiazepines, chlordiazepoxide, Librium, introduced in 1960, and diazepam, Valium, in 1963, these drugs promised a new kind of relief. They were designed specifically to calm anxiety, reduce tension, and promote a sense of well-being without the heavy sedation of earlier barbiturates. These new tranquilizers quickly became associated with a particular demographic: the stressed or anxious housewife. The phrase "mother's little helper," later immortalized in song, perfectly captured this phenomenon. These pills were marketed, prescribed, and consumed as aids for coping with the perceived stresses of modern life, particularly the demands of managing a home and family. They offered the appealing prospect of smoothing over the rough edges of daily life, calming frazzled nerves, easing worries, and helping women maintain the expected facade of cheerful competence and maternal patience, even when feeling overwhelmed or unhappy. The pharmaceutical companies launched massive advertising campaigns for these new drugs, often targeting women directly through advertisements placed prominently in popular women's magazines and medical journals read by general practitioners. These campaigns were highly effective in shaping both public perception and medical prescribing habits. The ads skillfully tapped into the anxieties and aspirations of the era, presenting the medications not just as treatments for specific disorders, but as tools for better living, essential aids for navigating the challenges of modern femininity and achieving the desired state of calm domesticity. The imagery used in these advertisements often told a specific story. A typical ad might depict a woman looking stressed, tired, or irritable, while dealing with crying babies, messy kitchens, demanding husbands, or the vague pressures of social obligations. Her brow might be furrowed, her posture tense. This image would then be contrasted with another, showing the same woman transformed after taking the advertised tranquilizer, now serene, smiling, patient, efficiently managing her tasks, suggesting that the medication was the key to unlocking this idealized state of feminine poise and capability. The message was clear: distress was treatable with a simple pill. Consequently, physicians, particularly general practitioners who were the primary point of contact for many women seeking help for everyday complaints, often prescribed these tranquilizers quite freely. When women presented with symptoms like anxiety, insomnia, fatigue, irritability, diffuse aches and pains, or simply expressed feelings of being overwhelmed or unhappy, symptoms often labeled vaguely as nerves, a prescription for Miltown, Librium, or Valium became an increasingly common response. It offered a quick, seemingly straightforward solution to complex, often ill-defined problems, satisfying both the patient seeking relief and the busy doctor. This ease of prescription, however, frequently occurred without a deeper exploration of the potential underlying causes contributing to the woman's distress. The pressures of conforming to restrictive gender roles, the potential for social isolation in sprawling suburbs, marital difficulties, financial worries, lack of intellectual or creative outlets, frustration with limited opportunities outside the home, or the lingering effects of past trauma. These complex psychosocial factors were often not investigated. The focus remained firmly on managing the symptom, the anxiety, the sleeplessness, with medication rather than addressing the context in which the symptom arose. The cultural expectation that women should be happy and fulfilled in their roles as wives and mothers played a significant role here. If a woman expressed persistent unhappiness or anxiety despite having the socially prescribed ingredients for contentment, a husband, children, a comfortable home, it could be interpreted as a sign that something was wrong with her. Her distress might be seen as a failure to adapt, a chemical imbalance, or a personal shortcoming. In this context, medication could seem like a logical step to correct the problem and help her fit back into the expected mold of cheerful domesticity. The availability and aggressive promotion of these tranquilizers subtly reinforced this narrative. The problem wasn't the potentially stressful or unfulfilling situation, nor the restrictive societal expectations. The problem was the individual woman's inability to cope adequately. The pill became a tool not just for managing anxiety, but for managing dissent, for smoothing over the cracks in the facade of universal female contentment. It offered a way to quiet the distress without questioning the circumstances that might be producing it, locating the issue firmly within the individual's chemistry or psyche. But the result was medication on an unprecedented scale. Throughout the 1960s and into the 1970s, Valium became one of the most prescribed drugs in history, with Librium and others also achieving blockbuster status. Tens of millions of prescriptions were written annually, predominantly for women. Studies from the era consistently showed that women were prescribed psychotropic drugs, particularly tranquilizers and sedatives, at rates 2 to 3 times higher than men. This widespread consumption reflected not necessarily an epidemic of defined mental illness, but arguably an epidemic of medicated unhappiness and stress among women navigating constrained lives. Indeed, these drugs were frequently prescribed for conditions that might not meet clinical criteria for anxiety disorders or depression, but rather fell into the category of everyday struggles, exhaustion from childcare and housework, sadness related to marital problems or loneliness, frustration with lack of personal fulfillment, or the general stress of trying to live up to impossible ideals. They became a way to take the edge off, to get through the day, to manage feelings that were perhaps normal human responses to difficult or limiting circumstances, effectively medicalizing the challenges inherent in the restrictive female role of the era. While offering undeniable short-term relief from feelings of anxiety and tension for many, the widespread and often long-term use of these benzodiazepines came with significant downsides that became increasingly apparent over time. Tolerance could develop, requiring higher doses for the same effect. Psychological and physical dependence were serious risks, leading to difficult withdrawal symptoms if the medication was stopped abruptly. What started as a temporary aid could evolve into a long-term dependency, trapping users in a cycle they found hard to break, a problem often underestimated or dismissed by prescribers initially. Furthermore, addiction to prescribed medication carried a particular stigma for women in this era. While alcohol abuse in men might be somewhat tolerated or even romanticized, female dependence on pills was often seen as shameful, a sign of weakness or moral failing, something to be hidden. This stigma could prevent women from seeking help, forcing them to maintain the outward appearance of normalcy and composure, the very facade the pills were perhaps intended to support, while struggling privately with dependence, adding another layer of hidden suffering to their lives. The image thus emerges of the mid-century woman, perhaps outwardly serene, efficiently running her household, always ready with a smile, yet potentially reliant on mother's little helper to maintain that calm. The pill promised peace, a way to silence the inner turmoil, the anxieties, the dissatisfactions that didn't fit the perfect picture. It smoothed the surface, ensuring conformity, but beneath the tranquilized facade, the underlying issues often remained unaddressed, festering in the quiet desperation of the suburban home. But what if, as later critiques would powerfully argue, this widespread anxiety being diligently medicated wasn't merely a collection of individual failings or chemical imbalances? What if it represented something more significant? Could this pervasive sense of unease, this quiet suffering necessitating millions of prescriptions, be interpreted as a collective warning signal? Perhaps it was a silent scream, an unconscious Veblen-like protest against the limitations, the isolation, and the stifling expectations imposed upon women by the culture itself. A symptom not just of personal distress, but of societal dysfunction. This alternative perspective gained powerful momentum with the rise of the second-wave feminist movement, which surged into public consciousness in the late 1960s and flourished throughout the 1970s. This diverse and energetic movement challenged traditional gender roles across the board, in the workplace, in education, in politics, in the family, and crucially, in the understanding of women's inner lives and experiences. Feminism offered a new lens through which to examine the roots of female discontent and anxiety. A key element of early second-wave feminism was the practice of consciousness raising. Small groups of women began gathering informally in living rooms across the country, simply talking and sharing their personal experiences about their marriages, their work, paid or unpaid, their relationships, their frustrations, their anxieties, their feelings of inadequacy or anger. These intimate conversations became revolutionary spaces where personal troubles were suddenly revealed as widely shared political problems. And within these consciousness-raising groups, profound realizations dawned. Women discovered that their feelings of isolation weren't unique. Their anxieties about conforming weren't isolated neuroses. Their frustrations with domestic drudgery weren't personal failings. Their experiences of being dismissed or unheard by doctors or husbands weren't uncommon. They began to see patterns connecting their individual struggles to broader systems of sexism, restrictive gender roles, and institutional power imbalances. The personal, they famously declared, was political. Flowing from these shared realizations, feminist analyses began to rigorously reframe the understanding of anxiety and depression in women. While acknowledging that individual biological and psychological factors play a role, feminists argued passionately that these conditions could not be fully understood without considering the social context. Anxiety could be a perfectly logical, even healthy response to being overworked and undervalued in the home, facing discrimination in the workplace, lacking economic independence, carrying the heavy burden of emotional labor in relationships, or having one's voice and experiences systematically silenced or trivialized. This critique resonated strongly with the phenomenon described by Betty Friedan in her landmark 1963 book, The Feminine Mystique. Friedan identified the problem that has no name, a vague but pervasive sense of unhappiness, emptiness, and lack of fulfillment, experienced by countless educated middle-class housewives who, according to the prevailing ideology, should have been perfectly content. Friedan argued this malaise stemmed from the denial of women's full human potential, trapping them in roles that stifled their intellectual and personal growth. This unnamed problem was precisely the kind of distress often being quieted by tranquilizers. The civic message of the feminist critique regarding women's mental health was powerful and transformative. The problem wasn't necessarily just in your head. It wasn't solely a matter of individual pathology, faulty brain chemistry, or unresolved childhood conflicts needing adjustment or medication. Often the problem was also deeply rooted in the walls, embedded within the restrictive social structures, the limiting expectations imposed by family and culture, the economic inequalities, the lack of real choices, and the silencing mechanisms that prevented women from naming and addressing the true sources of their pain. This shift in perspective encouraged women to break the silence, to speak out about their experiences, and to challenge the medical and psychiatric institutions that had often pathologized their distress or offered simplistic solutions like medication, without addressing underlying inequities. It fueled demands for therapies that acknowledged the impact of sexism in social context, and it inspired more women to enter the fields of psychology, psychiatry, and counseling, bringing critical perspectives and advocating for change from within the system itself. A new kind of listening began to emerge in some therapeutic circles influenced by feminist principles. Therapists started to help women connect their personal pain, their anxiety, depression, low self-esteem, to the broader social and political realities of their lives. Therapy became not just about exploring the inner world, but also about validating experiences of oppression, empowering women to challenge restrictive roles, and supporting them in finding their voices and seeking change, both personally and collectively. The narrative began to shift from what's wrong with me to what happened to me, and what systemic factors contribute to my suffering. In conclusion, the journey through the mid to late 20th century reveals a dramatic arc. It began with the quiet anxieties of the suburban housewife, often managed with mother's little helper, reinforcing a narrative of individual inadequacy. It culminated in the powerful feminist critique that challenged this narrative head-on, reframing female distress as potentially linked to societal structures and demanding that women's experiences be heard and validated. While the pathologization of female anxiety certainly didn't disappear, and biases undoubtedly remained, this period marked a crucial turning point, opening the door to more nuanced, context-aware understandings of anxiety, recognizing it not always as a flaw to be silenced, but sometimes as a voice calling for change. Our gentle drift through history continue, carrying us now into the closing decades of the 20th century, the 1980s and 1990s. This was an era marked by rapid technological advancement, particularly the dawn of the personal computer age and the Internet's early murmurs. Culturally, it saw shifts in music, fashion, and global politics with the end of the Cold War. Within the realm of mental health, these decades witnessed a significant consolidation of biological perspectives in psychiatry, accompanied by a powerful drive towards standardizing diagnosis and treatment, profoundly influencing how conditions like anxiety were understood and managed, especially for women navigating these changing times. The momentum towards biological psychiatry, which had been building for decades, gained significant traction during this period. Advances in neuroscience offered tantalizing glimpses into the brain's complex chemistry. Research increasingly focused on neurotransmitters, genetics, and brain imaging, seeking the biological underpinnings of mental disorders. This focus fostered hope for more objective diagnoses and targeted pharmacological treatments, moving further away from the perceived subjectivity of earlier psychodynamic or purely psychosocial models. The brain, rather than just the mind or the environment, became the primary locus of inquiry for many researchers and clinicians. Central to this shift was the growing influence and authority of the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, published by the American Psychiatric Association. The release of DSM-IN 109 in 1980 marked a pivotal moment, intentionally moving towards a descriptive, symptom-based diagnostic system with specific operational criteria for each disorder. This approach, further refined in DSM 3.0 in 1987 and DSM 3.9 in 1994, aimed to increase diagnostic reliability among clinicians, facilitate research by ensuring comparable study populations, and provide a standardized language for communication and, crucially, for insurance purposes. The DSM became the bedrock of mainstream psychiatric diagnosis. Within this evolving diagnostic landscape, the broad, often amorphous categories of neurosis or hysteria that had previously encompassed many anxiety states were systematically dismantled and replaced with more specific defined anxiety disorder categories. This effort aimed to bring greater precision to diagnosis, distinguishing between different patterns of anxiety symptoms, triggers, and associated features based on observable criteria rather than inferred unconscious conflicts or assumed constitutional weaknesses. Anxiety was meticulously categorized, its various manifestations given distinct names and diagnostic codes within the growing manual. One prominent category, formally defined, was generalized anxiety disorder, or GAD. This diagnosis captured the experience of excessive, pervasive, and difficult-to-control worry about a variety of topics: work, health, family, finances, often accompanied by physical symptoms such as restlessness, feeling keyed up or on edge, being easily fatigued, difficulty concentrating, irritability, muscle tension, and sleep disturbances. This described a chronic state of apprehensive expectation, a persistent hum of anxiety running beneath the surface of daily life, now classified as a distinct clinical entity. Another key diagnosis was panic disorder. This was characterized by the experience of recurrent, unexpected panic attacks, sudden, terrifying episodes of intense fear, peaking within minutes, accompanied by physical symptoms like heart palpitations, sweating, trembling, shortness of breath, chest pain, dizziness, or feelings of unreality or detachment. Crucially, the diagnosis also included persistent worry about having additional attacks or their consequences, often leading to significant behavioral changes, such as avoiding situations where attacks might occur. The raw terror of the panic attack itself was now formally recognized. The late 20th century also saw the firm establishment of post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD, as a distinct anxiety diagnosis, codified significantly in DSM-5. While initially recognized largely in the context of combat veterans, particularly from the Vietnam War, the criteria involving exposure to a traumatic event, intrusive recollections, memories, nightmares, flashbacks, avoidance of trauma stimuli, negative alterations in mood and cognition, and marked changes in arousal and reactivity, were applicable to survivors of many types of trauma, including physical or sexual assault, accidents, disasters, or abuse, experiences disproportionately affecting women. Other anxiety conditions were also more clearly delineated in the DSM during this period, such as social phobia, later termed social anxiety disorder, involving intense fear and avoidance of social situations due to fear of scrutiny or embarrassment. Specific phobias, characterized by marked fear of particular objects or situations like heights, animals, or needles, and obsessive-compulsive disorder, OCD, then often classified alongside anxiety, involving persistent intrusive thoughts, obsessions, and repetitive behaviors, compulsions aimed at reducing anxiety. The landscape of anxiety was being carefully mapped and labeled. This move towards specific criteria-based diagnoses represented in many ways a significant and welcome step forward. It decisively shifted the diagnostic framework away from historical explanations rooted in vague, inherently gendered concepts like the wandering womb, uterine irritation, or constitutional female nervousness. The focus was now on observable symptoms and patterns of distress, applicable regardless of gender, though prevalence rates might differ, and free from the overt biological determinism that had plagued earlier understandings of women's anxiety. The womb was finally off the hook, diagnostically speaking. Moreover, receiving a formal diagnosis like GAD or panic disorder could be profoundly validating for individuals who had long suffered from debilitating anxiety, perhaps previously dismissed as just nerves or a sign of personal weakness. Having an official medical term affirmed the reality and legitimacy of their experience. It provided a name for their suffering, a framework for understanding it, and a shared language they could use to communicate their struggles to clinicians, family members, and potentially connect with others facing similar challenges through support groups or literature. There were practical advantages, too. The standardized diagnostic criteria laid out in the DSM facilitated much-needed research into the epidemiology, neurobiology, and effective treatments for specific anxiety disorders. Comparing results across studies became more feasible when everyone was using the same diagnostic language. Furthermore, in healthcare systems increasingly reliant on insurance, having a recognized DSM diagnosis was often essential for obtaining coverage for therapy, medication, or other treatments, thereby improving access to care for many who previously might have struggled to afford it. Psychiatry strived for scientific rigor. Yet despite these advancements in diagnostic clarity and the move away from overtly sexist historical concepts, familiar echoes of doubt, dismissal, and stigma often persisted in the lived experiences of women seeking help for anxiety in the late 20th century. The labels changed, the theories evolved, but the way individual women were sometimes perceived or treated in clinical encounters didn't always reflect a complete departure from older attitudes. Progress on paper did not always translate perfectly into compassionate, unbiased practice. Even with a recognized diagnosis, women might still encounter subtle skepticism about the severity or validity of their reported symptoms. Was her anxiety really that bad? Was she perhaps exaggerating her distress? Could her panic attacks be attention-seeking? These lingering doubts, sometimes internalized by women themselves after years of societal messaging, could make seeking help or openly discussing the extent of their suffering feel risky, potentially leading to underreporting or delayed treatment. Old habits of questioning female reports died hard. Similarly, symptoms that clearly met diagnostic criteria could sometimes be minimized or dismissed, attributed to temporary stress, hormonal fluctuations, or perceived emotional oversensitivity, rather than being recognized as part of a genuine clinical disorder requiring appropriate care. A woman describing intense worry might be told she worries too much, or her panic symptoms might be initially misdiagnosed as a physical ailment or simply stress requiring rest, delaying access to effective anxiety treatment. The risk of not being taken seriously remained a concern. And while specific diagnoses might seem less stigmatizing than vague labels like hysteria, the broader stigma surrounding mental illness certainly persisted. Women might still hesitate to seek help for anxiety disorders, fearing judgment from family, friends, or employers. They might worry about being labeled as unstable, incapable, or too emotional. This fear could lead to suffering in silence, attempting to manage debilitating anxiety alone rather than risk the potential social or professional consequences of acknowledging a mental health condition, even one with a precise DSM code. Let's imagine a hypothetical yet plausible scenario from this era. Picture a woman in, say, 1993, perhaps in her 30s, juggling work and family, who starts experiencing sudden, terrifying panic attacks. She feels like she's dying, losing control, going crazy. The attacks come out of the blue, leaving her shaken and fearful of the next one. After weeks of suffering, she nervously consults her family doctor, managing to describe the frightening episodes between waves of anxiety about being dismissed. The doctor, perhaps recognizing the classic symptoms based on DSM criteria learned in medical school or continuing education, might offer a diagnosis relatively quickly. It sounds like you have panic disorder. This validation could bring immense relief. The doctor might then provide a brief explanation, perhaps offer a patient education pamphlet, prescribe a medication, maybe a benzodiazepine like Xanax or Klonopin for rapid relief, or start her on one of the newly popular SSRIs like Prozac or Zoloft. and advise her to rest, avoid caffeine, and try to reduce stress in her life. This scenario highlights a potential shift in focus during this era. While the explanation was no longer a faulty womb or weak nerves, blame could subtly shift towards the individual's lifestyle, particularly for women perceived as trying to have it all, managing careers, families, social lives. Anxiety might be framed as a consequence of taking on too much, being overwhelmed, or lacking adequate stress management skills. The problem wasn't inherent female fragility, perhaps, but a failure to successfully navigate the complex demands of modern life. The advice given often reflected this lifestyle focus. Instead of enforced rest cures, women might be encouraged to actively manage their stress. You need to learn to relax. Have you tried jogging or yoga? Maybe take a vacation or cut back on your work hours. Ensure you're getting enough sleep and eating well. While often well-intentioned and potentially helpful, this advice placed the burden of adaptation squarely on the individual, sometimes overlooking systemic issues like workplace pressures, lack of affordable childcare, or unequal domestic responsibilities that contributed to the stress. Psychotherapy, especially evidence-based approaches like cognitive behavioral therapy, CBT, gained significant recognition during this period as an effective treatment for anxiety disorders, often recommended alongside or as an alternative to medication. Therapy offered a space to understand triggers, challenge anxious thoughts, and learn coping strategies. This represented a valuable expansion of treatment options beyond purely pharmacological or lifestyle approaches, empowering patients with psychological tools. However, accessing therapy and finding a therapist who truly understood and validated a woman's experience without resorting to gendered stereotypes could still present challenges. Some women reported encountering therapists who seemed quick to interpret their anxiety through a lens of female emotionality, perhaps viewing tears as inherent fragility rather than a valid expression of pain, or conversely interpreting a lack of visible emotion as denial or resistance. Assumptions about women's roles or psychological makeup could subtly influence the therapeutic process. It sometimes felt, for some women navigating the mental health system in this era, that even with a precise DSM diagnosis, their condition came with an invisible asterisk denoting female patient. This might manifest in assumptions made by clinicians, the types of questions asked or not asked, the treatment recommendations offered, or simply the underlying sense that their anxiety was somehow intrinsically linked to or colored by their gender in ways that might not apply to male patients with the same diagnosis. The playing field didn't always feel entirely level. Nonetheless, the power of receiving that official diagnosis, generalized anxiety disorder, panic disorder, PTSD, cannot be understated. For countless women, it was a crucial turning point. It provided external validation that their suffering was real, recognized by medical science and not a figment of their imagination or a sign of moral or personal failing. It allowed them to name their experience, to seek specific information, to potentially find community with others who understood, and to move forward with treatment grounded in a shared clinical understanding. A major factor shaping treatment in the late 1980s and 1990s was the arrival and explosive growth of selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors, SSRIs. Medications like fluoxetine, Prozac, sertraline, Zoloft, and Pax offered a new mechanism of action, primarily targeting the neurotransmitter serotonin. They were aggressively marketed by pharmaceutical companies as major breakthroughs in treating not only depression, but also a wide range of anxiety disorders. SSRIs were often promoted as being safer, having fewer side effects, and being non-addictive compared to the older tranquilizers like benzodiazepines, though discontinuation symptoms could still occur. The narrative of correcting a chemical imbalance in the brain became widespread, simplifying the complex nature of anxiety and depression for both clinicians and the public and positioning SSRIs as targeted, effective solutions. They quickly became first-line treatments for many anxiety conditions. However, this strong focus on pharmacotherapy, while undoubtedly beneficial for many individuals in managing debilitating symptoms, also drew criticism. The ease of prescribing an SSRI could sometimes lead to medication being offered as a primary or sole solution, potentially overshadowing or replacing the need for deeper psychological exploration or therapy. Patients might receive pills without a thorough assessment of contributing factors like unresolved trauma, difficult family dynamics, ongoing psychosocial stressors, or ingrained patterns of thinking and behaving. The prevailing approach, sometimes driven by time constraints in clinical practice, insurance limitations on therapy sessions, or the powerful influence of pharmaceutical marketing, including direct-to-consumer advertising, which began in the U.S. during this period, could lean towards a model of symptom reduction, You have this diagnosis, take this pill, feel better. While effective symptom management is crucial, this model risks neglecting the broader context of the person's life and the deeper why behind their anxiety. Therefore, the progress witnessed in the late 20th century can be characterized as significantly advancing the clinical and diagnostic understanding of anxiety disorders, yet perhaps lagging in ensuring consistently compassionate, holistic, and contextually sensitive care in practice. Standardization through the DSM brought clarity and facilitated research. New medications offered hope and relief for many, but the risk of reductionism, reducing complex human suffering to a diagnostic label and a chemical target, remained. And so, even with a diagnosis, even with medication that might take the edge off the panic or quiet the incessant worry, the underlying sources of fear or unease could persist unaddressed. The loneliness felt despite a busy life, the lingering effects of past hurts, the anxieties rooted in societal pressures or existential concerns, these might remain untouched by a diagnostic code or a daily pill. The clinical framework provided structure, but didn't always reach the deepest layers of human experience. We conclude our drift through this era, recognizing the immense strides made in naming and categorizing anxiety, moving definitively beyond blaming women's bodies. We see the rise of targeted treatments offering tangible relief. Yet, we also hear the faint, persistent echo of a question that perhaps wasn't always asked or answered by the increasingly medicalized approach. Beneath the labels, beyond the prescriptions, the fundamental human plea for understanding might still whisper, will someone ever truly try to understand why I am so afraid? And so, our journey through the long and winding history of how anxiety in women has been understood and treated brings us gently into the 21st century. We arrive in an era defined by unprecedented technological connectivity, the constant hum of the digital world, and a seemingly greater public awareness and discussion around mental health than ever before. Yet, alongside hashtags promoting wellness and online mental health resources, the pressures of modern life persist, evolving and manifesting in new ways, continuing to shape women's experiences of anxiety and the search for understanding and relief as we navigate the complexities of today, May 2nd, 2025. Building upon the diagnostic frameworks established in the late 20th century and informed by the vital critiques raised by feminist movements, the early 2000s saw a continued search for more nuanced and integrated ways of understanding psychological distress. While biological models remained influential and standardized diagnoses provided structure, there was a growing recognition that labels and chemical explanations alone often failed to capture the full picture, particularly the profound impact of lived experience on mental well-being. A deeper, more holistic perspective began to gain traction. A significant development in this direction has been the rise and increasing integration of trauma-informed care principles across various fields, including mental health. This approach represents a fundamental shift in perspective, moving away from focusing solely on symptoms and diagnoses towards understanding the pervasive impact that trauma and adverse experiences can have on an individual's neurological, biological, psychological, and social development. It acknowledges that distress often stems from past wounds rather than inherent defects. At the heart of trauma-informed care lies a simple but profound shift in the guiding question. Instead of asking, "What's wrong with you?" implying pathology or deficit within the individual, the primary question becomes, "What happened to you?" This reframes symptoms, including anxiety, hypervigilance, dissociation, or difficulty regulating emotions, not as inexplicable malfunctions, but potentially as understandable adaptations or survival strategies developed in response to overwhelming or harmful past experiences. The focus shifts from pathology to history and context. From this perspective, anxiety is often understood less as a discrete disorder originating solely from a chemical imbalance or faulty thinking patterns, and more as a complex psychobiological response deeply intertwined with life experiences. Chronic anxiety, panic attacks, or pervasive worry might be seen as the nervous system's lingering response to past threats, a state of heightened alert that became ingrained due to experiences of danger, instability, or violation. It's the body and mind remembering, trying to protect itself based on past learning. Crucially, the understanding of what constitutes trauma has also broadened significantly beyond single, life-threatening events. There is growing recognition of the impact of small t traumas, chronic stress, developmental trauma such as childhood emotional neglect or inconsistent caregiving, experiences of abuse, physical, sexual, emotional, exposure to violence, and the corrosive effects of systemic oppression, discrimination, poverty, and harassment. These experiences, often pervasive, can shape the nervous system and contribute significantly to anxiety later in life. Applying this trauma-informed lens to women's experiences offers powerful insights. It allows us to connect symptoms of anxiety, depression, or burnout to the realities many women navigate: the cumulative stress of everyday sexism and microaggressions, the higher rates of sexual assault and domestic violence, the unique pressures associated with pregnancy and motherhood, the challenges of workplace discrimination or harassment, the burden of unequal domestic and emotional labor, or the internalized pressure to achieve impossible standards of perfection in appearance, career, and family life. For many women, encountering this perspective brings a profound sense of validation. Understanding that their anxiety might be linked to past experiences, perhaps childhood difficulties, past relationships, traumatic events, or the ongoing stress of navigating an unequal world, can be incredibly freeing. It reframes their fear, worry, or hypervigilance not as irrational personal failings or signs of being broken, but as understandable consequences of what they have endured. Their feelings finally make sense within the context of their lives. Thinking about anxiety as potentially stemming from a wound, an injury inflicted by difficult experiences upon the psyche or the nervous system, offers a different kind of hope compared to viewing it as an inherent flaw or a fixed chemical imbalance. Wounds, even deep ones, can be tended to. Healing may not mean the scar disappears entirely, but it suggests the possibility of recovery, integration, and finding ways to live with rather than be constantly overwhelmed by the echoes of the past. It shifts the focus from defectiveness to resilience and recovery potential. However, this growing awareness of trauma and context exists in jarring juxtaposition with persistent societal values that often seem diametrically opposed to healing and well-being. We live in a culture that still relentlessly glorifies productivity, speed, efficiency, and constant striving. Resilience is often narrowly defined as the ability to quickly bounce back from adversity, often without acknowledging the pain or need for rest, reinforcing pressure to perform wellness and capability even when struggling internally. This pressure manifests intensely in the expectations often placed on women in the 21st century. The ideal of having it all, successfully juggling a demanding career, a thriving family life, a vibrant social circle, personal fitness goals, and maintaining a composed, attractive exterior, remains potent. Fueled by curated social media feeds and cultural narratives, the expectation is often not just to manage everything, but to do so seemingly effortlessly, leading to immense internal pressure and anxiety about falling short of this impossible standard. This contemporary pressure cooker has given rise to new terms that attempt to capture the resulting distress, reflecting old feelings in modern contexts. The concept of burnout, once primarily associated with specific helping professions, is now widely recognized as a state of profound physical, mental, and emotional exhaustion resulting from chronic, unmanaged stress, common among women trying to meet relentless demands at work and home, often without adequate support or recognition. Another familiar feeling given a name is imposter syndrome. This describes the internal experience of feeling like a fraud, doubting one's accomplishments, and fearing exposure as inadequate, despite external evidence of competence. While not exclusive to women, it is reported frequently by those navigating fields where they are underrepresented or contending with systemic biases that constantly challenge their sense of belonging and capability, feeding anxiety about performance and perception. And then there's the widely relatable concept of high-demanding anxiety. This describes the experience of achieving success, appearing capable and calm externally, meeting deadlines, maintaining relationships, essentially functioning well by societal standards, while internally grappling with persistent anxiety, excessive worry, overthinking, perfectionism, difficulty relaxing, and often physical symptoms of stress. Struggle with insecurity is the modern iteration of the hidden struggle, the mask of capability concealing significant inner turmoil. In seeking help for these complex states, the therapy landscape of the 21st century offers more options than ever before. Stigma around seeking mental health support has lessened considerably compared to previous generations. The rise of online therapy platforms has increased accessibility for some. A wider range of therapeutic modalities is available, including those specifically focused on trauma, cognitive patterns, or somatic experiences. Finding help is, in theory, easier. Yet challenges remain. Access to affordable, high-quality therapy is still unevenly distributed. Finding a therapist who is not only skilled but also truly trauma-informed, culturally competent, and sensitive to the nuances of gender, power, and societal pressures can still require significant searching and resources. The risk of encountering therapists who rely on outdated assumptions or offer superficial solutions persists, highlighting the ongoing need for critical awareness and seeking care. The digital age, particularly the ubiquity of social media, adds another layer of complexity. On one hand, online platforms can foster connection and community, allowing individuals struggling with anxiety to find others with shared experiences. access information and feel less alone. Hashtags and online groups dedicated to mental health awareness offer spaces for mutual support and validation, breaking down isolation in powerful ways. On the other hand, social media often functions as a powerful engine of comparison and pressure. Curated feeds showcasing idealized lives, constant performance, even the performance of authentic vulnerability, and the relentless influx of information can significantly exacerbate anxiety, feelings of inadequacy, or fear of missing out. The digital world promises connection, but can often deliver increased pressure and a distorted sense of reality, making inner peace feel even more elusive. Amidst this digital noise, we often encounter well-meaning but sometimes frustratingly simplistic self-care advice, exhortations to just drink more water, try meditating for 5 minutes, practice gratitude, or buy a particular wellness product flood online spaces. While these practices can certainly be part of a larger toolkit for well-being, they can feel deeply inadequate or even invalidating when presented as solutions for anxiety rooted in significant trauma, systemic injustice, or overwhelming life circumstances. True healing often requires more than a quick fix. Despite these complexities and persistent challenges, a discernible shift seems underway in the broader cultural understanding of anxiety, particularly among younger generations and within informed therapeutic communities. There is a growing recognition that experiencing anxiety is not inherently a sign of weakness, defectiveness, or personal failure. Instead, it's increasingly understood as a complex, multifaceted human experience, often carrying important information about our inner state and outer circumstances. Anxiety is perhaps being reframed less as an enemy to be eradicated and more as a signal, albeit often a distressing one. It might be understood as a message from our nervous system indicating overload, threat, real or perceived, or unmet needs. It could be seen as history whispering, the echoes of past experiences, personal or even intergenerational, showing up in the present moment, reminding us of old wounds or learned patterns of fear that require attention and care. From a physiological perspective, there's growing popular understanding of the nervous system's role. Anxiety can be viewed as a state of dysregulation, the body's threat response system, the fight-flight-freeze response, becoming chronically activated or easily triggered due to past experiences or current overwhelming stress. We might hear people say their nervous system wasn't built for this noise, acknowledging the mismatch between our evolutionary biology and the relentless demands and stimulation of modern life. This understanding fuels an emerging counter-narrative to the hustle culture that dominated recent decades. We see a growing movement towards consciously seeking rest, prioritizing slowness, and disconnecting from the constant barrage of stimuli. This isn't necessarily about laziness or apathy. It's often driven by a hard-won recognition that perpetual motion, constant striving, and neglecting rest inevitably lead to burnout, disconnection, and worsening anxiety. It's about sustainability over sheer speed. Crucially, this contemporary embrace of rest differs profoundly from the enforced, infantilizing rest cures of the past. Today's movement often frames rest as an active choice, a form of resistance against societal pressures that demand constant productivity and availability. It's about reclaiming one's time, energy, and right to well-being. It's chosen rest, self-directed rest. Rest as a radical act of self-preservation in a world that often seems determined to exhaust us. This soft revolution manifests in small but significant ways, learning the difficult art of saying no to demands that exceed one's capacity, canceling plans without feeling consumed by guilt, consciously choosing imperfection by letting the dishes sit or the inbox overflow, prioritizing sleep, spending time in nature, or simply doing nothing. It involves acknowledging the persistent whisper of guilt or inadequacy, but choosing to honor one's own needs anyway, recognizing that we don't owe anyone our exhaustion. Community plays a vital role in sustaining this shift. Finding others who share these struggles and support these choices helps combat the isolation and self-blame that anxiety often breeds. Shared vulnerability, the simple act of saying "me too," can be incredibly powerful. Moving away from an individualistic push-through-at-all-costs mentality towards mutual support, holding space for each other's difficulties, and collectively challenging unrealistic expectations fosters resilience in a healthier, more connected way. This collective process also involves rewriting the narrative of healing itself. There's growing acceptance that healing from anxiety, trauma, or burnout isn't a linear progression towards a fixed endpoint of being cured or fixed. Instead, it's often an ongoing process of navigation with fluctuations, setbacks, and periods of both ease and struggle. It involves learning to accept and make space for the full spectrum of human experience, recognizing that some days involve functioning and achieving, while others might involve crying, resting, or simply surviving, and crucially, affirming that both are okay. And so, as we conclude this long historical journey, perhaps we can hold a final, gentle reframing of anxiety, seen through the lens of centuries of misunderstanding, pathologization, and silencing, but also through the emerging insights of trauma-informed care and conscious resistance. Maybe anxiety isn't solely a sign of being broken. Perhaps, in many instances, it is a sign of being awake to the pressures, the dangers, the injustices, and the beauty of a complex world. Perhaps it's a sign of sensitivity, of deep feeling, of being profoundly human in an environment that often encourages us to numb ourselves or conform. A signal, perhaps, not of failure, but of life itself, asking for attention, care, and understanding. And so, our long, quiet drift through the corridors of history comes to a gentle close. Like a boat reaching a calm shore after navigating vast and sometimes turbulent waters, let your awareness settle softly back into this present moment, here in the quiet stillness of May 3rd, 2025. We've journeyed together through centuries of evolving thought, witnessing how the simple human experience of anxiety, particularly for women, has been perceived, explained, and often profoundly misunderstood. Thank you for lending your quiet presence to this exploration tonight, for allowing these stories of the past to unfold gently around you as you prepared for rest. May the peace we sought in this shared time linger with you now. As we rest here at the end of our journey, perhaps hold a gentle awareness of the immense arc we've traced. Remember the ancient ideas of wandering wombs and humoral imbalances, the spiritual interpretations of the Middle Ages that saw distress as sin or possession, the delicate nerves and harsh rest cures of later centuries, the rise of psychoanalysis shifting focus to the mind, the era of medicated conformity with Mother's Little Helper, and the slow, ongoing movement towards understanding rooted in trauma, context, and lived experience. It has been a long road, marked by persistent efforts to explain away, control, or silence female distress, but also by a gradual, hard-won emergence of greater empathy, validation, and insight. If this journey through history has stirred anything within you, or if you arrived here carrying your own burdens of worry or unease, allow this gentle reminder to settle in. Your feelings are valid. Whatever resides in your heart or mind tonight, be it anxiety, sadness, fatigue, uncertainty, or even just a quiet sense of being overwhelmed, it is real, it is human, and it deserves acknowledgement, free from the echoes of past judgments or dismissals. You do not need an ancient theory or a modern diagnosis to legitimize your internal experience. Simply feeling it is reason enough for it to be treated with kindness, especially by yourself. Remember, too, amidst the constant demands and pressures of the modern world, that you are not a machine. You are not designed for perpetual motion, endless output, or unwavering emotional composure. You are a living, breathing being, intrinsically connected to rhythms of effort and ease, engagement and withdrawal. The need for rest, for stillness, for time simply to be without striving, is not a flaw in your design. It is a fundamental requirement for well-being, as essential as air or water, a truth often forgotten in a culture that relentlessly prioritizes doing over simply being. Therefore, choosing rest, truly choosing it, allowing yourself to sink into genuine repose, letting go of the internal editor that lists all the things you should be doing, is not weakness. It is not laziness. It is, perhaps, a profound form of wisdom. It's an alignment with an ancient knowledge that understands the necessity of fallow periods for growth. It can be a sacred act of tending to your own spirit in a world that often neglects it. And sometimes, in its quiet defiance of unsustainable demands, choosing deep, intentional rest can even feel like a small, personal, yet deeply revolutionary act. Thank you once again for joining this quiet exploration tonight, for traveling through these layers of history with us. As our time together ends, allow the journey's end to be an invitation simply to let go. Allow yourself to settle more deeply into wherever you are resting. Allow your body to soften, releasing any tension you might be holding. Allow your breath to flow easily, gently, without effort. There is nothing more you need to do now. Nothing to figure out, nothing to solve. Simply rest. Simply be. Sleep well.